What's up, gamers? Welcome to my first of hopefully many Magic YouTube videos. Today I'm presenting my list for the most cubeable cards from Magic the Gathering Foundations. This is a style of article I used to write. My most recent article on this kind of topic was Bloomborough, so I haven't put anything out for Duskmorn yet. It's on my to-do list, but one thing at a time. Let's start today with my picks for the most cubeable cards from Magic the Gathering Foundations. Right, first let's talk about what I mean by most cubeable. That's of course a subjective thing. It means different things to different people. That could be influenced by your playstyle, your cube size, your budget, really any number of different things. My general focus for these lists is on traditional 1v1 gameplay with 40 card decks, and I'm considering that gameplay in a very broad sense. I'm looking for what's most appropriate for most cubes and is most impactful when it actually shows up. This can be something that's a totally new effect that maybe opens up new space, something that is efficient in a way that we haven't seen before, or even something that's redundant on infrastructure that already exists and is going to juice up some commonly played archetype. This is not a list of the most powerful cards from the set, not by a long shot. Power and fun can be and often are inversely correlated. There's a lot of discourse right now about how much people like or don't like Time Vault and the Magic Online Vintage Cube. So I'm not just saying these are the best cards, you should play with the best cards. It's been a long time since Cube has just been that. These are the cards that I generally find the most fun and appealing. And they're not just the cards that are going to my cubes either. There's a lot that goes into that. I'm just kind of keeping an eye out for what I think could be the biggest value add to the world of Cube at large. Before I get into my picks for the most cubeable cards from a set, I always like to take some time to reflect on the themes of that set. Magic Foundation doesn't have anything really new going on in that department. There's no new keywords to understand, no new mechanics. The set is also in fact half reprints, and it's very much designed with a new player experience in mind. So you see some stuff like Raid showing up that says, hey, maybe you want to attack with your creature if you're on the fence about it. You see things like typal synergies, which are kind of easy to understand foundations for building a deck. And there's an emphasis on simple and elegant designs, shorter text boxes, vanilla creatures. We haven't seen a vanilla creature in a standard release in years, which is wild to think about. I kind of selected Anthem of Champions here as a nice card to kind of show up what the set's about. You see just one line of text, even on a gold card there. There's room for flavor text, which also we don't see too much these days. So simple and elegant, but again, not weak. Anthem of Champions is a pretty solid rate. We have it here. It's not on my top 10 list, but it is a card that I do think is pretty meaningful for the world of Cube at large. Magic Foundations also was concurrently released with a Jumpstart set. If you're not familiar with Jumpstart, these are 20 card booster packs with the intention being that you take two, shuffle them together, and you have ready to play 40 card decks. The Jumpstart release has 29 additional new cards. If you wanted to pour over that entire file, it wouldn't take too much time at all. I do just want to highlight my picks for the three most significant cards here that do jump out, and these are all cards that I will be tracking down from my personal cubes. The first is Wriggling Grub. It's 1 and a black for a 1/1 worm. When Wriggling Grub dies, you create two 1/1 black and green worm creature tokens. This is kind of a unique effect in that you really don't see 2-mana creatures that give you 3 bodies. There's a lot of 2-mana creatures that will either through Persist, Undying, manifesting a creature, they'll give you 2 bodies, but this is fully 3. And that's going to be significant for cubes with any kind of sacrifice theme, particularly being an uncommon means it can fit into peasant environments, so I do think that this is pretty unique and worth noting. The next card would be Go Forth. It's a 1 green mana instant. With a modal ability, you choose one. You either search your library for a basic land, reveal it, and put it into your hand, then shuffle, or target creature gets +2/+2 until end of turn. So it's either like a Lay of the Land effect or a slightly weaker Giant Growth. It's notable to have a Lay of the Land kind of effect at instant speed. It's not the biggest deal. It doesn't really matter because you can only play lands on your own turn in that way, but it does let you leave the mana up and be tricky. In particular, just being able to wait, maybe you have a creature in play and you do kind of want to search for a basic land, but maybe combat gets hairy and you want to use this +2/+2 effect. This seems significant to me, at least in the context of Pauper cubes. And lastly, we have Scythe Cat Cub, 1 and a green for a 2/2 cat with trample and landfall. Whenever a land you control enters, you put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. And if this is the second time this ability is resolved this turn, you double the number of +1/+1 counters on that creature instead. This is very Bristly Bill adjacent. It's not legendary, so it's better against Karakas. And this, I believe, is the most powerful card in the main set and the Jumpstart just all together. I think Scythe Cat Cub is like the strongest card. It is uniquely powerful in terms of green beatdown decks, especially in conjunction with fetch lands. Recently, I know that we're all pretty tired of Nadu Winged Wisdom, but it's personally become a feature of my Vintage Cube. Scythe Cat Cub, along with Bristly Bill and Springheart Nantuko, really helps facilitate those kind of Nadu engines, while also just being really good at beating down. So it's just more naturally at home in the cube because there's this green aggressive deck that's totally fine to play. Also seems sweet to me for the Tempo Tubert. The card is pretty expensive. I think they're still retailing for like 35 bucks. Kind of taking a bath on that, but it's a card that is certainly worth talking about in the context of the World of Cube. With all that preamble out of the way, it is now time for my picks for the 10 most broadly cubable cards from Magic Foundations, starting with number 10, Sire of Seven Deaths. Sire of Seven Deaths is a 7 mana Eldrazi creature. It does a 7/7 with 7 keywords. Those are First Strike, Vigilance, Menace, Trample, Reach, Lifelink, and Ward, pay 7 life. That amount of keywords doesn't take up that much text box, but it does amount to a lot on the battlefield. So this is a really strong creature to cheat in, whether you're talking about reanimating with the most powerful enablers of all time, Reanimate, Animate Dead, even on Burial Rites and maybe a more value-oriented environment, this can be quite strong. It's decent enough to channel in. This card could just show up in like the Magic Online Vintage Cube, but I wouldn't bat an eye. Even though it's not the strongest thing to like sneak attack in, it is eminently castable, which is really a big deal when it comes to these creature cheat strategies. Just being able to cast a creature counts for a lot, because sometimes your setup is interacted with, you can't really cheat the creature into play the way that you want to. 7 is an achievable number of mana. This isn't an Ulamog, it's not a Kozilek, it doesn't cost 10. Like 10's a fake number in the upper right hand corner. 7 is just totally castable, and this creature can really take over a game even if you're casting it for 7 mana. If you've played much Foundations Limited, you've probably seen that in action. It's strong in lower power environments, and it's not embarrassing in higher power cubes. I mentioned this card could just hang in the Magic Online Vintage Cube, and it could definitely just show up in a cube that's at a much lower power level. Ward 7 life is strong, but it's not insurmountable. This isn't something like Ward pays 7 mana. It's not ever going to stop you from casting your removal spell unless you're already dead. 7 life, you're not going to be from 20 and suddenly in a huge predicament because this card shows up. As long as you have a removal spell that answers it, you should be able to play on. So it's really endearing in terms of being powerful, but not totally overpowered. At number 9, we have Mossborn Hydra. Mossborn Hydra is 2 and a green for a 0/0 Elemental Hydra. It has Trample and enters with a +1/+1 counter. It also has Landfall. So whenever a land you control enters, you double the number of +1/+1 counters on this creature. So on turn 3, it's showing up as a 1/1. If you just make one land drop on turn 4, then it's a 2/2. But a fetch land right away makes that a 4/4. So it's a scalable threat. And I also like that it's easy to interact with. You'll generally have a window where this creature will die to any 1 or 2 damage effect. It's vulnerable to a lot of other removal otherwise, so it's pretty cheap. It gets quite large, but it's not just lights out. So I do like threats that can scale and become a huge problem when you have that window of easy interaction. That definitely makes them fit into more environments. You can have like this giant, awesome creature that's not all that difficult to assemble, because it does often just die to a stiff breeze. A shock will typically be able to answer Mossborn Hydra. And Landfall also opens up a lot of options regarding designing around this card. Just cubes where you can put a lot of extra lands in play. This card plays very differently whether your cube has fetch lands or not. If you're heavy on fetch lands, it plays even more differently. So there's avenues where this card, even though it's a relatively basic shape, can look very different in different environments, which I think is pretty cool. At number 8, we have Spinner of Souls. Spinner of Souls is 2 and a green for a 4/3 Spider Spirit with Reach. And it also says whenever another non-token creature you control dies, you may reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal a creature card. Put that card into your hand and the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. So the spider itself doesn't generate any value if your opponent just immediately lightning bolts it, but it does make it so your other creatures, maybe you play this and you have some attacks that are set to trade on the battlefield already set up. Suddenly those attacks make blocking for your opponent a pretty scary and undesirable proposition. It's efficient, but it's not outrageous, again, because it does just trade with a lightning bolt. It's reasonable to just cast. 2 and a green is pretty easy to come by. But then if you want to actually build a deck around it or an environment around it, it plays very well with sacrifice themes. And green's options relative to something like black or red tend to be a little bit more limited, so this does open up new space. If you're looking to branch into green for a sacrifice theme, Spinner of Souls is a really great way to help facilitate that. At number 7, we have Scrawling Crawler. Scrawling Crawler is a 3-mana 3/2 artifact creature. It's a Phyrexian construct that says at the beginning of your upkeep, each player draws a card, and whenever an opponent draws a card, that player loses 1 life. I first want to point out that Howling Mine is just a strong card to have in an aggressive deck, particularly a deck that has some reach. If you have some Lava Spikes, maybe not literal Lava Spike, but Lightning Bolt, Burst Lightning, that kind of thing. Having extra draws to help just close the game that way is pretty useful for an aggressive deck. And the damage dealing ability on Scrawling Crawler makes that even more useful. Your opponent's taking a damage every turn on their draw step, they're taking a damage every time you trigger that ability, and anytime they want to draw some extra cards, they're going to take a damage for the trouble on that too. And there's also powerful synergies and combos that open up just by nature of being an artifact. Goblin Welder and Mishra's Workshop, of course, come to mind, but there's many lower power ways to synergize with an artifact as well. But on a higher power front, the list is pretty long. Memory Jar is an exciting card for me to pair a Scrawling Crawler. This is specifically going into my vintage cube, but I see a lot of appeal for this card at lower power levels as well. Coming in at number 6, we have Leyline Axe. Leyline Axe is a 4-mana equipment. And if it's in your opening hand, you may begin the game with it on the battlefield. It says equipped creature gets +1/+1 and has double strike and trample, so sort of an Embercleave type buff there, and it equips for 3. The primary reason I want to shout this card out is because I have pregame actions is the most fun sentence you can say to open a game of Magic. Just starting with something on the battlefield is super cool, and most Leyline designs to this point are generally not great for a cube. What are you going to do, put Leyline of the Void in your cube? Very unlikely that that leads to good gameplay. On the topic of good gameplay, Leyline Axe is imposing, but it's not automatically game-ending. Double Strike and Trample is a really big deal, but it costs 3 mana, and your opponent's going to see it coming. If you draw it late in the game and cast it and equip it for 7 mana, that's a really steep investment. It's not going to feel like it's overpowering in that regard. And it's scary, but again, it doesn't end the game when it just starts on the battlefield. And it also opens up some weird synergies as a sometimes free 4-mana artifact. Just anything that cares about having cheap artifacts on the battlefield, that could be Affinity, that could be Metalcraft. You can also get to some specific cards that open up even more exciting avenues. Metalwork Colossus, and I've played against somebody in Magic Online playing this card with Crabomination in Modern, which I don't know if that's something I would recommend trying at home, but it's very cool. Number 5 is Alesha Who Laughs at Fate. Alesha Who Laughs at Fate is a 3-mana 2/2, 1 black and red, a legendary creature human warrior with first strike. Whenever Alesha attacks, you put a +1/+1 counter on it, and it also has a independent raid ability that says at the beginning of your end step, if you attacked this turn, return target creature with mana value less than or equal to Alesha's power from your graveyard to the battlefield. And I really like those separate attack triggers. You can get that raid ability the turn that you cast Alesha. You won't be able to scale Alesha that turn unless you can give it haste some other way or pump it some other way. So it's going to limit the size of something you can bring back right away. But you can get something back. And then over time, that trigger is different. The Alesha is going to grow larger. Just attacking and getting +1/+1 counter is already a very different ability than the recursion ability, and it scales the recursion ability as well. Alicia is strong in generic aggressive decks while also pushing sacrifice synergies. That recursion ability is going to be very good just if your opponent's trying to block or cast kill spells, but then it's going to be really good if you are putting your creatures into your graveyard on your own accord. And human and warrior are both well-supported creature types for the history of Magic. My Spooky Cube has a big human theme. It also has a sacrifice theme, so Alicia fits so perfectly in that environment. I've had a lot of fun playing with this card already. At number 4, we have Seer Slicer Goblin. Seer Slicer Goblin is a 2-mana, 2/1 Goblin Warrior for 1 red. It has Raid. At the beginning of your end step, if you attack this turn, create a 1/1 red Goblin creature token. This is a card that I was a little bit afraid of when I played against it at the pre-release, but I found that it actually was pretty manageable in the games that I played, which was surprising. It's exciting and it's strong, but it's not oppressive, which opens up the space for it being a really fun card. It's an efficient token maker for sacrifice or go wide, or even just generic aggressive decks. There's no shortage of historical support for goblins if you want to have goblins matter as a creature type. Warrior also has some support as well. And your opponent's going to be able to check this card pretty effectively by blocking, just making a 1/1 every turn, checking if you attack. There's also a bit of tension because if you attack and you try to get that 1/1, you could just end up in a spot where you made a bad exchange in combat and then the goblin dies to some removal spell, which most removal spells are going to answer Seer Slicer Goblin. So it's a strong card. It maybe looks like it's really snowbally and scary, but in my experience, even just in retail limited, the card was quite manageable, largely just by blocking. So it's an exciting and fun card, and it's not backbreaking. So I think that makes for a really exciting card to try to make work in Cube. At number 3, we have Sphinx of Forgotten Lore. Sphinx of Forgotten Lore costs 2 blue for a 3/3 Sphinx with flash and flying. And it also has, whenever this creature attacks, target instant or sorcery card in your graveyard gains flashback until end of turn. The flashback cost is equal to this card's mana cost. So kind of a Snapcaster Mage, but only to be used proactively in that kind of flashback ability. It has a modestly sized flash body, which is appealing. You have this attacker that you can flash into your opponent's end step. It's also a really sizable blocker, in terms of just eating 2/2s in combat. That's an appealing part of the card, but it's not oppressively large. It's just strong. It's just at a decent rate. It's a strong control finisher, but it can't lock opponents out with counterspells. I actually really like the fact that it's only flashing things back on your turn. You can't just have this creature that you can cast at instant speed and it gives you some way to interact with your opponent on the stack or immediately on their turn. You have to go to your own turn, you have to be able to attack, you have to be able to target a card in your graveyard, and it has to be good at sorcery speed. So this is a really good card to load up on Doomblades and manage your opponent that way, but it's not just going to break your opponent with counterspells and what have you. It's not going to bury them every time with just any generic card. And I also like that it scales with the strength of spells in the environment. Most often, I think Sphinx of Forgotten Lore is going to be trying to cast things like Fatal Push, and that can help play a control game, but it's also a card that can just show up in a Vintage Cube and flashback an Ancestral Recall or a Time Lock. So there's a range of things that can happen with this card, and I could really see it showing up at higher or lower power levels and just being able to hang in either. At number 2, we have Vengeful Blood Witch. Vengeful Blood Witch is a 2-mana 1/1 Vampire Warlock for 1 and a black. And it has, whenever this creature or another creature you control dies, target opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. So this is nothing new, but it is a powerful ability. Somewhere between Blood Artist and Zulaport Cutthroat. What I really like about this card is that effect scales in multiples. Your sacrifice deck wants as many Blood Artists as it can get its hands on. And it only triggers off your own things, so it's not as good as Blood Artist in that regard. But it does have 1 power, so it can attack for damage or even trade in combat. And again, when you're sacrificing your own creatures, you want to hit your opponent for as much life as possible and also gain as much life on your own as possible. So more is better with this kind of card. And also at uncommon, It's legal and peasant, like many cards of this nature are, but that just makes it playable in a wider range of environments. If you're rarity restricted, anything outside of a Pauper cube where you can only play commons will be able to play this card, and I do expect this card to show up in quite a lot of cubes, even though it's not exactly the novel design space. And finally, at number 1, we have Kellen, Planar Trailblazer. Kellen, Planar Trailblazer is a 1 red mana 2/1 legendary human fairy scout. Has a couple activated abilities, but you can only activate them in order, starting with 1 and a red. If Kellen is a scout, which it starts as, it becomes a human fairy detective and gains whenever Kellen deals combat damage to a player, exile the top card of your library. You may play that card this turn. And then for 2 and a red, if Kellen is a detective, it becomes a 3/2 human fairy rogue and gains double strike. So the first activation just gives it that kind of card advantage generating ability, and the second activation makes it a little bit larger and gives it double strike so it can actually engage in combat with other creatures a little bit better. What I like about this card is that there's a high floor. A 1 mana 2/1 is going to check the boxes for just putting it in any aggressive deck, so I like that. And it scales well as the game progresses, obviously getting that ability to cast cards from the top of your library, getting that card advantage, as well as becoming a larger creature with double strike. That's really nice. You know, there's a lot of cards in this space, Figure of Destiny being the first design that we've seen, and most cards in this space have been quite strong in Cube and quite fun to play with. And I think that Kellen's abilities are very well balanced. They don't snowball too badly, and Kellen's relatively easy to interact with only 1 toughness. It's very easy to block Kellen. It's very easy to answer Kellen with a removal spell. And that first ability, that 1 and a red ability, doesn't make any of this less true. It only gains first strike when it gains double strike with the second ability. So it's just attacking as a 2/1 even if you use that first ability. So this card is strong and it scales well into the game, but it's relatively easy to answer, which I think makes for very fun creatures in aggressive decks. To recap my top 10, at number 10 we have Sire of 7 Deaths, at number 9 Mossborn Hydra, at number 8 Spinner of Souls, at number 7 Scrawling Crawler, number 6 Leyline Axe, number 5 Alesha Who Laughs at Fate, number 4 Seer Slicer Goblin, number 3 Sphinx of Forgotten Lore, number 2 Vengeful Bloodwitch, and number 1 Magic's main character, Kellen Planar Trailblazer. And finally, I would like to talk about the impact of Magic the Gathering Foundations on Cube. Notably, there were no white cards on my top 10 list, but that does not mean that white is just weak in the set or that there's nothing appealing, unique, or fun. There's a couple white cards I could definitely shout out. I just don't think that they materially impact the world of Cube as much as the cards on my list. And in fact, very little in Magic Foundations is groundbreaking, and it's really not intended to be so. That's not a bad thing. It's a set that had a goal of having very simple and elegant designs and was working on making those simple, elegant designs appealing, and I think that the set knocked things out of the park in that regard. I see Magic Foundations as a very well-designed core set, but ultimately it is still a core set. There is only half the cards are new cards, and there's no new keywords or anything like that. There's some cool designs, and like sets like Magic 2010 and core sets from that point on, there's going to be a number of cards from this set that are enduring, that we play with in cubes and constructed formats for years to come. It's just ultimately less impactful than non-core sets, and that's largely by design. This set is mostly for Standard, and mostly for getting new players interested in playing Standard and constructed Magic. It's less impactful than many Standard releases, but it has a very solid highlight reel. There's quite a lot of cards that are quite appealing from the set. And the Starter Collection, another separate release along with Foundations, it offers a really excellent, pardon the pun, foundation for building a cube. You get over 300 cards, almost 400 with that, and a lot of really fun cards to play with. I know that some other people, Dan Schneider off the top of my head, posted a list for how to trim that starter collection down into a nice ready to play Tubert design. I'll try to get that posted in my description on the video here. And it's definitely really cool. It's like the closest release that we have seen to a product that you can just buy and it being a kind of playable cube at retail. So really cool to see innovations in that space. And thank you for watching. My intention and hope is to make more YouTube videos here. I definitely want to do a similar style of video for Duskmorn, just another top 10 list, and I would like to do a year in review video. I'm hoping to be able to get that all out this month before the year ends, and then I'll start to think more about what I want to do as we go into 2025, as I am no longer kind of trailing my career as a writer, and I am more independently exploring doing video content. So let me know if you like what you saw here. Let me know what you might like to see in the future. Again, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.